This is not a mystery, and it's not a sudden accident. When the governor of New York starts sounding alarms about supply chain disruptions hitting retail, what she's really describing is a slow-motion policy failure finally becoming impossible to ignore. Retail is where economic stress shows up last, but when it gets there, it's already been building for months or years upstream. Governor Kathy Hochul didn't wake up one morning and decide to talk about supply chains because shelves looked messy. Her administration commissioned a statewide analysis because businesses across New York, especially small and mid-sized retailers, were reporting the same thing. Costs were jumping, deliveries were unreliable, inventory planning was breaking down, and margins were disappearing. That's not market noise, that's a structural signal. Here's the basic setup. Retailers sit at the very end of the supply chain. They don't mine raw materials, they don't manufacture components, they don't control shipping lanes or ports. They receive finished goods, price them, and sell them to consumers whose wages have not kept up with rising costs. So when something goes wrong earlier in the chain, tariffs, shipping delays, supplier consolidation, policy uncertainty, retail absorbs the shock. And if retail starts to crack, it means the pressure is already intense. Hochul's office pointed directly at federal trade policy, especially tariffs, as a major driver. Tariffs are often sold politically as penalties on foreign producers. In practice, they are taxes paid by domestic importers. Those costs don't vanish. They move. Manufacturers pass them to wholesalers. Wholesalers pass them to retailers. Retailers, if they can, pass them to consumers. If they can't, they eat the loss, cut labor, or shut down. The state's own preliminary findings estimated effective tariff costs in the range of roughly 20% on certain imported goods. Translate that into household terms, and you're talking about thousands of dollars a year in higher costs. Translate it into retail terms, and you're talking about a business model that no longer works unless prices rise or operations shrink. This is why the alarm is being sounded now, not earlier. The cumulative effect has reached the storefront. And notice who is most exposed. Big national chains have leverage. They can pressure suppliers, reroute sourcing, or absorb losses temporarily. Small retailers cannot. They order in smaller volumes, rely on fewer suppliers, and have less cash to buffer shocks. When tariffs fluctuate, shipping gets delayed, or suppliers raise prices with little notice, these businesses don't have flexibility. They have deadlines and rent. So when the governor frames this as a threat to New York's economy, that's not rhetoric. Retail employs millions nationwide and anchors local commercial districts. When retailers struggle, the damage spreads. Fewer jobs, weaker tax bases, emptier main streets. Supply chain disruption isn't abstract. It becomes visible when a store can't restock, can't hire, or can't stay open. The key point is this. What Hochul is reacting to is not a temporary glitch. It's the predictable outcome of policy choices layered on top of already fragile global supply systems. The question isn't whether disruption exists. The question is why the burden keeps landing on the same actors at the bottom of the chain, and who exactly benefits from keeping it that way. That takes us directly to the mechanisms behind these disruptions and why they keep repeating. To understand why these disruptions keep happening, you have to stop thinking in headlines and start thinking in mechanisms. Supply chains don't break on their own. They respond to incentives. And the dominant incentive shaping this situation is policy-driven cost pressure, especially tariffs layered onto already concentrated and fragile production systems. Start with tariffs, because that's where the chain reaction begins. A tariff is not paid by a foreign country. That's political theater. A tariff is paid by the importer, usually a US-based firm bringing goods or components into the country. That importer then faces a simple decision: absorb the cost, pass it on, or change suppliers. In most retail-related sectors, absorbing the cost is impossible long-term. Margins are thin by design, so the cost moves forward. Manufacturers raise prices on finished goods. Wholesalers adjust contracts. Retailers receive higher invoices with little warning. And crucially, this happens before the consumer ever sees a price tag. By the time prices rise at the register, the damage has already been done internally. Inventory plans scrapped, orders delayed, credit lines stretched. Now add volatility. Tariffs are not just high, they're unpredictable. Announced, paused, expanded, threatened, reintroduced. That instability matters as much as the level itself. Retail supply chains rely on forecasting. Orders are placed months in advance. When policy signals are unclear, firms either overorder to hedge or underorder to avoid risk. Both outcomes are bad. Overstock ties up cash. Understock means empty shelves and lost sales. This is where disruption becomes systemic. A retailer facing tariff uncertainty doesn't just deal with higher costs. They deal with timing failures. Goods arrive late. Containers sit waiting for clearance. Suppliers change terms mid-contract. The entire rhythm of retail, seasonal ordering, promotions, staffing, gets thrown off. And tariffs don't operate in isolation. They collide with structural realities that were already in place. Supplier concentration means fewer alternatives. Decades of cost-cutting and just-in-time logistics mean minimal slack. Shipping networks optimized for efficiency, not resilience, buckle under policy shocks. When one link tightens, there's nowhere for the pressure to go except downstream. Labor constraints add another layer. Ports, trucking, warehousing all depend on labor markets that have been tight and uneven. When delays occur, they cascade. A missed shipment doesn't just delay one store, it disrupts regional distribution. Retailers don't control these nodes, but they pay for the failures. The end result is a cost and risk transfer. Federal policy creates uncertainty. Large upstream firms buffer or pass along the shock. Retailers, especially smaller ones, become the shock absorbers. They face higher prices, worse terms, and more volatility without gaining any additional power or protection. This is why calling it a supply chain disruption can be misleading. It suggests a technical malfunction. What's actually happening is a policy-induced reallocation of risk. Risk is being pushed downward, onto the actors least able to manage it. And once you see that clearly, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who is getting hurt the most when this risk piles up? And how visible is that damage when it reaches workers and consumers? When this kind of disruption works its way through the system, it does not hit everyone evenly. It never does. The damage concentrates, predictably, on those with the least power to deflect it. In this case, that means small and mid-sized retailers first, and consumers immediately after. The structure of retail guarantees it. Start with the retailers. Independent stores, regional chains, family-owned operations. These businesses run on thin margins and tight credit. They don't negotiate from strength. When suppliers raise prices because tariffs increased their costs, small retailers don't get to argue. When shipping delays force rushed orders or alternative sourcing, small retailers pay more per unit. When inventory arrives late, they miss sales windows they cannot recover. Large national chains can smooth these shocks. They have diversified suppliers, in-house logistics teams, and enough cash to absorb temporary losses. Small retailers do not. They face a simple squeeze. Costs rise faster than prices can be raised. Raise prices too quickly and customers disappear. Don't raise them and the business bleeds. Either way, something gives, often labor. This is where disruption becomes social. Retailers respond by cutting hours, freezing hiring, delaying wage increases, or reducing benefits. Not because they want to, but because payroll is the largest controllable expense. Supply chain disruption, in practice, becomes labor discipline. Workers feel it as instability long before any official layoffs are announced. Now look at consumers. From the outside, higher prices look like inflation in the abstract. But on the ground, what people experience is more specific. Fewer choices, inconsistent availability, and prices that jump without explanation. A product that was there last month is gone this month. A substitute costs more. Promotions disappear. For households already stretched, these changes matter. And this isn't limited to luxury goods. The New York State analysis highlighted impacts in sectors like food, construction materials, and everyday household items. That means the effects show up in grocery aisles, hardware stores, and pharmacies. Retail is where trade policy becomes personal. There's also a geographic dimension. Local retail districts, especially in lower income or rural areas, depend on smaller stores. When those stores struggle or close, access declines. Consumers travel farther, pay more, or go without. The market does not adjust smoothly. It leaves gaps. What makes this especially damaging is timing. These pressures hit during periods when consumers are already cautious. Wage growth lags. Housing and energy costs stay high. So retailers face price-sensitive customers who cannot absorb increases easily. That forces more discounting, which further erodes margins, which feeds back into instability. So, when policymakers talk about supply chains, this is what they're really talking about. A system where policy shocks land on small businesses and working households, not on the actors who designed or defended those policies. The suffering is dispersed and individualized, making it easier to ignore, which brings us to the political response. Because once the damage becomes visible at the retail level, elected officials face a choice: treat it as unavoidable fallout, or treat it as a policy problem with responsibility attached. That choice is what shapes the next phase. Once the damage reaches this level, politics enters whether policymakers want it to or not. Retail disruption is not an abstract metric. It shows up in closed storefronts, angry business owners, and voters paying more for basics. That's the point at which governors start speaking carefully, and that's exactly what we're seeing from New York's executive branch. Governor Hochul's response has been to reframe the problem publicly. Instead of treating higher prices and retail stress as unavoidable global forces, her administration has pointed directly at federal trade policy as a driver. That is a political move, not just an economic one. It shifts responsibility upward. It says, these costs are not natural, they are chosen. The state's multi-agency tariff impact report serves that purpose. It quantifies the damage, job risk, household cost increases, sectoral exposure, so the issue can't be dismissed as anecdotal. Numbers matter in politics because they create a paper trail. Once a state produces an official estimate of thousands of dollars per household in tariff-related costs, ignoring the problem becomes harder. At the same time, Hochul's administration has tried to signal that the state is doing something, even within its limited authority. Resource guides for businesses, coordination across agencies, public warnings, these don't fix supply chains, but they communicate alignment with small businesses and consumers. Politically, that matters. It says, we see the problem, and we're not pretending it's your fault. There's also a legal and intergovernmental angle. States like New York have explored challenges to the scope of federal tariff authority, or at least coordinated opposition. This isn't just about trade, it's about federalism. When federal policy imposes concentrated costs on specific states or sectors, governors are incentivized to push back, especially when they can frame the issue as protecting local economies. But there's a constraint here. States do not control trade policy. They cannot repeal tariffs. They cannot renegotiate supply chains. So much of the response remains symbolic or defensive. The real levers are in Washington, where trade policy is often driven by electoral strategy and geopolitical signaling rather than downstream economic effects. This creates a political tension. State leaders warn about retail collapse while federal leaders defend tariffs as toughness or leverage. Meanwhile, the costs accumulate locally. The longer this gap persists, the more likely it is that states either escalate their opposition or absorb the damage quietly. And that leads to the forward-looking question. If this policy structure stays in place, if tariffs remain volatile and supply chains remain exposed, what does that mean for the future of retail, employment, and local economies? Because the current response is not a solution, it's a holding pattern. If nothing changes, the outcome is not ambiguous. Retail adapts by shrinking. That is how systems under sustained cost pressure respond when they lack pricing power. Fewer stores, fewer workers, narrower product ranges, higher prices. Not because of mismanagement, but because the underlying math no longer works the way it used to. For retailers, the The likely path forward under continued disruption is defensive restructuring. That means shorter inventories, fewer suppliers, less experimentation, and more conservative hiring. Businesses become less resilient precisely because they are trying to survive. Ironically, policies justified as strengthening domestic industry end up making local retail weaker and more fragile. Consumers will feel this as normalization of scarcity, not empty shelves in the dramatic sense, but reduced choice, inconsistent availability, and permanently higher baseline prices. Once those price increases are locked in, they rarely reverse. Retail becomes more transactional, less competitive, and less responsive to community needs. There are policy alternatives, but they require admitting trade-offs. Tariff relief targeted at essential goods would reduce immediate pressure. Longer-term supply chain investment, ports, logistics, domestic manufacturing capacity could build resilience, but only with sustained funding and planning. None of this is quick, and none of it fits neatly into campaign slogans. What's missing is accountability. Trade policy is often debated in terms of national strength or strategic rivalry. Rarely is it evaluated by its effects on small businesses, retail workers, or household budgets. Yet those are the groups absorbing the costs. Until that imbalance is addressed, disruptions will continue to be framed as external shocks rather than predictable outcomes. The warning from New York should be read clearly. When retail starts to fail, the problem is no longer theoretical. It means policy risk has migrated all the way down the chain. At that point, the question is no longer whether something is wrong, but whether policymakers are willing to change course, or whether they're prepared to let local economies quietly absorb the damage.